The King James Bible is a good translation, but it's not as good as it was 400 years ago because of the way language changes. I watched a movie recently called The Professor and the Madman. It was a Mel Gibson movie, and it was about the development of the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, which is an expansive dictionary that's meant to capture the entirety of the English language. So instead of being one volume like your typical desktop dictionary, like a Webster's dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary is multiple volumes, and a volume might only cover one or two letters of the alphabet. So this was a huge undertaking, especially for the first edition. And it wasn't meant just to catalog the entire English language, but to also track its history, the way word usage changes century by century, and to have examples of the word usage in literature to demonstrate the context that these words were being used. And towards the end of the movie, as they were sort of finishing the project, one of the characters said to the professor, Mel Gibson,
Come with me. Come, I want to show you something.
Yeah, I need new dunnage. What? With a sprat? How'd you do that? I told him it was a quid and a blag.
Dunnage, sprat, blag. How many new words to replace the old? How many new words for things that have yet to be imagined? How many of them in your all-encompassing book? No language can ever be permanently the same, James. Not if it springs forth from life.
But how can the work be ended if not ever completed?
You have given us its heart, along with a great jolt to begin the first few beats. Generations after you will continue this work because you have showed them the way. But it will never be completed.
because the language is constantly changing, you can never have a definitive dictionary because there's always new words being created and you have words being used in new ways. So it's a moving target. And the same could be said about Bible versions. Even if the King James Bible had been 100% perfect 400 years ago when it was first published, because the language changes, it's not going to be perfect for audiences today. Words that used to be clearly meaning one thing mean another thing today. We even looked at an example in the last video where the translators chose to translate a word that meant army. They thought about using army, but changed it to host, referring to the angels as a multitude of the heavenly host. And in doing so, that shaped the way people think of the word host, and it lost its association as meaning army, and people started thinking of it as meaning multitude. So even though the King James Bible translators picked a perfectly appropriate word in that moment of history, even their publication influenced the way and changed the way people thought of certain words. So the issues with the King James Bible for today's audience, one is flat out mistranslations, imperfections. There are some words that I think it's fair to say are mistranslated or translated in an imprecise way in the King James Bible. I mean, any Bible translation might have some flaws in it. The King James Bible is a good translation, so these are relatively infrequent and minor. But what's a bigger obstacle would be dead words, that is, words that have just fallen out of usage. Now, you can look them up. They're typically still defined in a dictionary, but they slow down the reader. You hit a word, you're like, what does that mean? And the more frequently those words come up, the harder it is to just read the text, right? So that interferes. But worse yet is words that you think you know that you don't because they're being used in a different way than we're familiar with. Those are false friends. A false friend is when you go from one language to another, sometimes you'll see a word in another language that looks familiar. It looks like a word that we know in our language. Like, for instance, in French, their word that looks like our word demand means ask. And so those are related, but they mean something different. So if you're learning French and you see that word, you might think, oh, that must mean demand, but it doesn't. It means ask. And the same thing happens within our language over time. The meaning and the range of meaning of words shifts so that Today's audience can read something written 400 years ago and misunderstand it because we naturally apply our current understanding of what a word means to the text that was translated 400 years ago. In the earlier video, I showed an example of a page out of a King James only advocacy book criticizing the modern translations for translating a Greek word that means teacher or the Hebrew word rabbi as teacher or rabbi, where the King James Bible had translated as master. And the King James only person is thinking that master means like a master servant role, and master also means teacher. So that would be an example of a false friend. People still use the word master in some contexts as teacher, but had the word teacher been used in the King James, that misunderstanding wouldn't be possible. But indeed, there are words that are mistranslated in the King James Bible. And just like with that master teacher thing, King James only advocates will defend the mistranslation in the King James and vilify modern translations that are actually translating correctly. So I have an example here, another piece of King James only propaganda. And we have 4 verses where in the King James Bible, Jesus is referred to as God's son or God's child. And in the New King James Bible, which it labels as a counterfeit Bible, it's really bad because these 4 verses have Jesus called God's servant, his servant Jesus, your holy servant Jesus. And there's a note that says, it also says servant in the NIV, the ASV, the ESV. So the New King James Bible is just as bad as all those other terrible modern translations that also use the word servant, and that modern versions attack the sonship of Jesus. And so this is very typical with King James only advocates. Their standard is the King James Bible, and anything that deviates from that is a corruption. And it doesn't matter what the source text word is. They don't want to look at that. The King James Bible text is perfect, and any deviation from that is necessarily a corruption. And the only reason someone would change any text, any word choice from what's in the King James Bible is because they have malicious intentions. In this case, they're attacking the sonship of Jesus. Wake up, people, get back to the King James Bible and stop using these corrupt texts. Now, the word that's translated here, the Greek word that's translated as son or child in the King James and servant in the modern versions, is pais. And pais means a servant. That's what the word means. It means a servant. And it can also mean a child or a young man, right? Even in English, sometimes a male servant is called a boy or a female servant is called a girl, like the receptionist is called the girl out front or something like that. So this word in Greek, similarly, it can mean a servant or it can mean a child. The word pais, this is where we get words like peasant or in Italian, paisan, paisano. That's kind of like in English how we have the term the little guy. Could mean a little kid or someone of low social status. It means servant or child, depending on the context. It doesn't typically mean one's son, one's own offspring. As an example, in Matthew 2, when it's speaking of the slaughter of the innocents by Herod, he slew all the children that were in Bethlehem. And that is the word pais. It's the plural of the word pais, speaking of children in this context, right? So it can mean children, but it's not son. Speaking about children generally. In Luke 2, we see speaking about the child Jesus in the King James. He came by the Spirit into the temple, and when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him after the custom of the law. So here we're talking about Jesus when he was a child, when he was a young boy, a baby. Not as being Mary's son, Mary and Joseph's son, but that he was the age of a child at this time, not when he was an adult. But there is another word in Greek, huios, that does mean son. This isn't it. These passages from Acts 3 and 4 don't have the word huios, they have the word pais. So why would that be? Well, maybe it's because the speaker, Peter, or the writer Luke, is not trying to say son. They're trying to say servant. And the modern translators recognize that, and so they correctly translate this word as servant. So the charge is that the word son or child here is being changed to servant in order to attack the sonship of Jesus. The modern translations want to deny that Jesus is the Son of God, and so they're changing it to servant. Well, if that's the case, the New King James and all the modern translations, they're doing a really terrible job of it. The New King James refers to Jesus as the Son of God 46 times in the New Testament. And in those places, the word being translated as son is typically huios. So it's a word that means son, and so it's translated as son. But when a different word is used, pais, if it's talking about Jesus being a little kid, it's translated as child. And when it's talking about him as a grown man, like here in Acts 3 and 4, it's translated as servant. So if the New King James and other modern translations were trying to attack or undermine the sonship of Jesus, they did a very inadequate job of it because they left dozens of times references to Jesus as the Son of God. Now, in the King James Bible, here's a passage from Matthew 12, quoting Isaiah 42. It says, "Behold my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased." And it's referring to Jesus. It's applying this to Jesus and calling him my servant. It's translating the word pais, referring to Jesus as my servant. So now what? So the King James Bible, I guess, is undermining the sonship of Jesus because it's using the word servant instead of son here. This is the same thing. This is the same terminology that's in Acts 3 and 4 in Greek. It's correctly translated here as servant. But the King James only advocates, anytime they see a word choice that's different in modern translations, they assume the illest of intent, that it must be evil, sinful people trying to undermine, trying to corrupt God's word. When here we have, this is merely a correction to a mistranslation. Now, why? Why did the King James translators choose to call Jesus God's son and child in Acts 3 and 4 rather than servant like the modern translations have? Well, we can look at the 1602 Bishop's Bible that they used as their base text, and we see that they just didn't update this. This is left unchanged from the previous translation they were using as a starting point. The same terms, son and child, were used in the 1602 Bishop's Bible, and the King James Bible translators just didn't change them. So this wasn't even an active word selection. This was a passive choice. They just didn't update what had already been translated by earlier translators. So once again, you have King James only advocacy that backfires. They're trying to make the point that the King James Bible is superior to modern translations because look at this example. Here's a word choice, and we like what's in the King James better. But you look at the Greek, you look at the context, and you realize, no, the King James Bible was actually wrong here. The word choice is more appropriate in the New King James and other modern translations, which is why those choices were made. Just like the King James translators improved upon work that was done earlier with the 1602 Bible, the New King James translators and other modern translators are looking at where improvements and corrections could be made compared to the King James version. The translators of the King James Bible understood that this was going to be an ongoing process of refinement. So we're going to look at some examples in the King James Bible of dead words, false friends, and mistranslations. Sometimes it's going to be hard to tell whether something that looks wrong in the King James Bible, is that because it was mistranslated, or is it a case where it's a false friend, where it would have been understood correctly 400 years ago, but because the words have changed meaning over time, they're going to be misunderstood by readers today. Even King James only advocates tend to make these comprehension mistakes because of the false friends. So the first one I want to look at here is Romans 12:9. The King James says, "Let love be without dissimulation. Abhor that which is evil, cleave to that which is good." And in particular, I want to look at this term, dissimulation. I would consider that to be a dead word. I really like this verse. It kind of goes against the idea that, you should just love everyone, love everything, be loving all the time, that kind of nicey nice Christianity. This is saying, no, in order for your love to be true and real, you have to also hate that which is evil. But the word dissimulation, I don't think I've ever seen this word used outside of Romans 12:9 and one other passage in Galatians, like outside the King James Bible. I don't know that I've ever seen this word used. And this verse has been on my radar for the last 25 years because I like this verse and what it's communicating. I've been aware of this distinction between the King James Bible and New King James and other translations. So this verse is why I know what dissimulation means, but I never see this word being used. So the New King James renders this, let love be without hypocrisy, abhor what is evil, cling to what is good, right? So there's just some word choices. Even cleave, I think, cleave means cling, or at least it used to, but we also think of cleave like a cleaver splits your cut of meat into two, right? So cling is a more appropriate word nowadays than cleave when you're talking about clinging, holding fast. So this verse has been a favorite of mine for the last 20 some years. And so it's because of this verse that I know what dissimulation means. I know that it means hypocrisy. And in my experience, if you're talking to, say, somebody who reads out of the King James Bible and who's well versed in its vocabulary, if you were to ask them, what does dissimulation mean? They'll tell you it means hypocrisy. So then that kind of leads to the question, like, what if we just substituted that in and say hypocrisy instead of dissimulation? Well, now you're corrupting God's word. You can't do that. You can't change the text. But even in their heads, when they see dissimulation, they're thinking hypocrisy. In real time, they're interpreting these dead words with what they know that they mean nowadays. And if you saw my last video, I was reading the King James preface. And as I'm reading it, I was sort of doing this in real time. Like, it's hard to read 400-year-old text and use their vocabulary because it's a bunch of words that we don't use or we use in different ways. Like when I'd get to the word peradventure, I would change it to perhaps. When I got to the word current at one point, I changed it to circulate. Because if you don't do that, you're not going to be understood. So the question would be, why not replace these dead words with words that are going to be more readily understood by today's audience? And in this case in particular, this word, dissimulation, you can still find it in dictionaries. So you look it up, it says it's the inclination or practice of misleading others through lies or trickery. This is from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and there's a bunch of synonyms here, things like fakery, deceptiveness, deceit, secrecy, craftiness, and down there you also find the word hypocrisy. And likewise, if you look up hypocrisy, it says the pretending of having virtues, principles, or beliefs that one in fact does not have. And among its synonyms, you'll find a lot of the same words: deception, fakery, and dissimulation is in there, right? So these are synonyms. They both have to do with putting on an act, putting on a mask. Like actors, especially in ancient times, they would wear a mask. They would have a false face. So it's pretending to be someone that you're not. It's pretending to think things that you don't really think. Either word, the words are synonymous. What would be the objection then to substituting hypocrisy for dissimulation if the words mean the same thing, other than you're just beholden to the King James Bible and you think that it's sacred in every single word use? But here's the thing. When you look at what is the word being translated, it's anapokritos, which is a compound word. So this is the phrase without dissimulation or without hypocrisy. It's anapokritos, which is a prefix that means without, or a negation prefix. If it doesn't come before without, it would just be an A. That's what we find in words like atheist, asymmetry, things like that. And then, wow, look at that, a word that looks like hypocrite. It's the Greek word that our word hypocrite derives from. So without hypocrisy is actually even closer to the original language than without dissimulation. without dissimulation, it's not that it's wrong, it's that nobody knows what that means, right? So like, why not use the word hypocrisy? And if you say, oh, you're corrupting God's word, well, it's closer to the Greek word being translated just on the face of it, right? So why not do that? So what I say about, if you ask a King James only person, hey, what does this verse mean? They'll tell you it means hypocrisy, but they'll object to it being substituted in. And I was thinking about this. I like to show, if I'm talking about what Calvinism teaches, I like to quote John Calvin. Or if I'm talking about Augustine, I like to support my claims with quotes from Augustine. And in my first video on the King James Bible, I made some remarks about things that King James advocates do, like, some King James only advocates think that the King James English is actually superior to the original languages that it was translated from. It's like a perfection. And so like if you're in Greece and Greek is your native language, you're better to learn English, specifically 17th century English, and read the King James Bible than to read the original manuscript language of the New Testament. And I got some comments on the video and they varied. Like some people thought that was a ridiculous thing that I was saying. And other people were saying, yeah, I've had that experience too, where someone who's King James only would refer to the original English. And it's like, what are you talking about? Like they consider the King James Bible to be the original language. That's why in these propaganda things where they say, look how terrible it is that they're using the word teacher instead of master, or they're using the word servant instead of son. They don't look at what the original Greek word being translated is. The standard is the King James Bible, and anything that's different than that is a corruption. They have no regard for what the original language is, many King James only zealots. So I did a search for the word dissimulation because I wanted to kind of confirm that it's not just me. When considering this a dead word, it's not just me and my little world that I just don't encounter this word. So when I did a search for dissimulation, I pretty much just got dictionary entries for the word, the first half dozen or so results. And finally, I got to the word being used outside of a dictionary. And wouldn't you know it, it was in an essay, a blog entry written by a King James only advocate. And so I think that kind of proves the point, right? It's like this word is only being used nowadays in the context of quoting the King James Bible. It's not being used in other contexts. So sure enough, this article, there's a whole article here written by Sean Brousseau. Now, he had a link to his YouTube channel, and his YouTube handle is 1611 KJV Ambassador. So this guy, yeah, he's King James only, right? And it's a high priority for him. He's actually identifying, like that's the first thing he wants you to know about him, at least on YouTube, is that he is a King James only ambassador. So it was funny because this was sort of towards the end of the process of putting this material together, where I just wanted a little bit more. I thought, well, I just want to kind of confirm that this word is a dead word. And I came across this, and sure enough, he had some other articles about other passages that I had already prepared in this material. So we'll come back to him and look at what he has to say about some of the things I'm going to say about other passages. But to start with, here's what he says about what is dissimulation in Romans 12:9. Now, there's this whole article about it, and it really boils down to one statement. Well into the second paragraph, he says, in other words, it is hypocrisy. So here's a King James only advocate. He wouldn't want you reading the New King James Bible or any other translation. You have to read the King James Bible because that's God's word. And if you have any issue with the King James Bible, you're attacking God's word. You're attacking the scriptures. Not a translation, not a word choice, but the scriptures themselves. And he's saying, when people go, well, what does dissimulation mean? He says, well, it means hypocrisy. But that's the word that's in the New King James, right? So if we just put that word in Romans 12:9, then you wouldn't have to write big articles explaining what dissimulation means. There wouldn't be a lack of communication there. The Bible would be able to communicate more clearly with its intended audience. You don't have to go through this step of learning this word that fell out of usage hundreds of years ago. All right, so here's another example This one is a false friend. Genesis 1:28, this is God speaking to Adam and Eve. In the King James Bible, it says, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it." Replenish the earth. In the New King James Bible, it says, "Fill the earth." Now, you have entire weird theologies built upon the word replenish here, speaking to Adam, because in our vernacular, replenish typically means to fill again, to fill something that had been full before, and now you're refilling it. And so you get all this speculation that there must have been other people, there must have been a pre-Adamic world full of people, and now Adam is repopulating it. But the modern translations all say fill there. Well, if you look at the Hebrew word that's being translated, the word means fill. Same goes for the Septuagint. The Greek translation also means to fill, to make full. And even in English, if you look up replenish in the dictionary, here's from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the primary definition, the first definition, is to fill or build up again. And the second one says to fill with persons or animals, and it references this very verse, Genesis 1:28. So according to the dictionary, in this context, it means fill. Doesn't mean refill. And then definition 2c, which is archaic, which means it's not really used this way anymore, to supply fully or to perfect. So that's another way that could apply here to Genesis 1:28. It's not really used that way today. So if the Hebrew word means fill and replenish is being used in the sense of fill, why not just replace the word with fill to avoid all of this confusion? If we want people to understand what they're reading, wouldn't that help? Is there any way that fill could be worse than replenish here? In 1 Peter chapter 2, we have another example of false friends, words that can be easily misunderstood. Peter writes, "Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, foreigners," in that case, strangers means foreigners, and pilgrims, "abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation." Now, honest conversation, nowadays, conversation means when we speak to one another, and honest means you're not lying. So this sounds like it's talking about being truthful in what you say to people. But in the New King James Bible, it says, "Have your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation." So what Peter's really saying here is let your behavior be good. That way, when people speak out against you, others will realize that what they're saying isn't true. That your good works will refute the slander that people speak against you. So conversation does not mean conduct or behavior nowadays, but it used to. When this was translated 400 years ago, this was correct, appropriate word choice, but it just isn't anymore. So even if you look up conversation in the dictionary today, it means oral exchange of sentiments, opinions, and ideas. But definition 2, obsolete. It's not in use anymore. Conduct or behavior. So are we corrupting God's word by taking a word that was used 400 years ago and replacing it with a word that means the same thing today that conversation meant 400 years ago? Are we corrupting God's word by doing that? If your intent is to communicate the ideas that Peter was writing, why not use the words that will be understood by the audience instead of being beholden to the word choice that was appropriate 400 years ago? So here's a familiar passage in Luke 2. We read this every Christmas. In the King James Bible, it says, "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Quirinius was governor of Syria." And this is what led to Mary and Joseph returning to Bethlehem in order to be taxed, it says. So in modern translations, including the New King James, it'll say something about registration or a census. So was there a tax, like a monetary tax involved here? Well, the words being translated there from the Greek, apographistai is the verb, and then the noun is apographe. You can see the word graph in there, which means to write, and apo means off or from, or, prepositions kind of have a range of meaning and usage can change from one language to another. This basically means a writing down, a registration, what we would call a census. Not that there's a monetary exchange going on here, but that there's some sort of record being made. It's a recording. But the King James says that it's a tax. And I always thought this was a mistranslation and an unfortunate one because the historical context here has implications on when was Jesus born in history, what year, what time frame. So this phrase, all the world should be taxed or registered, if you interpret that as being taxed, it can be misleading. I have another video about this. It'll have this picture of Mary and Joseph in the thumbnail, and it has to do with this census of Luke 2. Some of this material is covered in more detail in that video. But this taxing, if you interpret it as a tax, you might think that this is talking about a tax census that occurred in 8 BC. You're thinking that Luke is talking about a time frame way back in 8 BC, a tax census that occurred every 20 years. But that would only apply to Roman citizens, and the 8 BC census was not the first of its kind, like it said in Luke 2 that this was the first such census. Another possibility that's sometimes proposed is that Luke is referring to Quirinius's AD 6 census, but we see more detail about that in Josephus's writings. This was a property census, and it was limited to Judea. It wasn't the whole world. And it's actually mentioned by Luke, who wrote Acts as well. It says taxing in the King James, and it calls it a census in the New King James. So it's consistent. It's the same word, apographe, and there's this reference to someone named Judas, which also appears in Josephus. So we can see that this is an allusion to that 86 census or taxing. So what was the apographe around the time of Jesus' birth? Well, there was a first of its kind census, which was an inventory of the entire Roman Empire, all the world, so to speak, right? And it was conducted in the 3-2 BC time frame, relating to the new title of Father of the Fatherland that was bestowed on Augustus on February 5th of 2 BC. And this commemorated the 25th anniversary of his reign. And Augustus had just turned 60 years old at that time. And it was also the 750th anniversary of the Roman Empire. So this was a big event. This was a big deal. And so for Augustus's legacy, the decree went out to get an inventory of the entire Roman Empire. That seems to be the census or the apographe being referred to here in Luke. So why does the King James keep referring to this apographe as a taxing rather than a census? Well, for starters, if we look at the 1602 Bishop's Bible that they use as their foundational text to be revised, it used the same terms. It used taxed and taxing. Those words were not changed by the King James Bible translators. But if you notice right here, they did add a little note. There's a little letter next to the word taxed, and then over here with the same letter, it says or enrolled. And sure enough, if you go to the 1611 Bible, you see they've got that very same note here, where for taxed it says or enrolled. So this is one of those alternate word choices. They deemed that either word could work here. So the Greek word apographe clearly has to do with writing things down. Why did the 1602 Bishop's Bible and other old translations think that this had to do with taxing? I thought, well, maybe the definition of tax has changed. And I look it up in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and sure enough, it lists definition 5, an obsolete definition. It says to enter a name in a list, and it refers to Luke 2:1. So Merriam-Webster here is saying that the taxing that the King James refers to in, for instance, Luke chapter 2, is not meant to be a levy, to levy a tax, but to make a record, to write names on a list. Now, Are they just running cover for a mistranslation in the King James Bible? Or was this really the way the word used to be used? Let's look at the etymology of the word tax. This is from Etymology Online. It says that the word means to impose a tax, demand, require, or impose a penalty. It comes from a French term, which in turn comes from a Latin term, which meant evaluate, estimate, assess, handle, right? So we're starting to get away from that it necessarily has to do with levying a monetary tax. Evaluate, assess, that would apply to a census too, right? Assessing the inventory of the empire. The meaning subject someone to taxation is from the early 14th century. So in the 1600s, the idea of subjecting someone to taxation was relatively recent. It was still in use, and you do find in the Old Testament one such place where tax is used in that sense. But we'll see in a minute, in the New Testament, in the King James Bible, it's really never used in that way, if you dig into it a little bit. Its use in Luke 2 in reference to the census translates Greek apographein, to enter on a list, enroll, is due to Tyndale, right? So just like we looked at the King James Bible, left it the same as what had been in the 1602 Bible, but it really goes back farther than that. The Tyndale Bible, which was 100 years older, also used this tax language. I also took a look at the Webster's Dictionary of 1828. This dictionary is particularly favored by King James only advocates as a tool to help to understand the language of the King James Bible. But even this is a couple hundred years later. So I was looking through these definitions to see if anything pointed more towards what we would call a census or a registration rather than the imposition of a monetary tax, and it really doesn't. So this is where now, if you're a King James only advocate and you think, if there's words we don't understand, we'll just look them up in the Webster's Dictionary of 1828. It's not going to be much help here. It's going to be less useful than the Merriam-Webster of today that makes a distinction that, yeah, that meant registration in Luke chapter 2. Okay, so what about the Vulgate, the Latin Bible? What word does it use? Is it a word that means like a writing down, or is it a word that means what we would call a tax today? Well, you can see here, you have words that resemble the English word describe and description, and then a different word for some of the later uses. But describe and description, that sounds more consistent with registration or making a list than collecting money. So looking at the rest of the references to taxes in the New Testament, comparing what's in the King James Bible to the New King James Bible is pretty interesting. So here in Matthew 22, talking about, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. In the King James Bible, you have the word tribute. They're not using the word tax, they're using the word tribute. And in the New King James Bible, this is translated as tax. So here, the King James is not using the word tax when it's talking about money that has to be paid to Caesar. It says tribute rather than tax. Now, what Greek word is being translated as tax in modern translations and tribute in the King James? Kensos. What does that look like? That looks like our word census. So why didn't the older English Bibles use the word census rather than tax? Well, this is a clue that the word census meant something different back then too. It's almost like these two words have flip-flopped in their meaning. Kensos meant tax, and tax meant census. So I look up the etymology of the word census, and it says in the 1610s, which is when the King James Bible was written, in reference to registration and taxation in Roman history, from the Latin census, the enrollment of the names and property assessment of all Roman citizens. So the use of the word census in English to mean registration is only from the 1610s. Like, this word was either a brand new word or wasn't in use yet when the King James Bible was written. It wasn't in their toolbox of options to use in Luke 2. And when it was introduced, it had to do with taxation, what we would call taxation today. Registration and taxation. It could be either or maybe both. So it wouldn't have been clear. And it wasn't until 1790 that its modern sense of enumerating the inhabitants of a country or state with details began. That was in the early days of America that usage came to be. So looking through Greek words having to do with what we would call taxation or registration and comparing the New King James to the King James, there's no overlap in the use of the word tax. Places where the New King James say tax, the King James had a different word, tribute. Taxes were called tributes. A tax collector was called a publican. The tax office was called the receipt of custom. Both translations sometimes use the word custom to mean tax, but then where the King James does say tax or taxing, the New King James is talking about a census or a registration. I was really surprised by this. I didn't realize tax didn't used to mean what we think tax means today. But I think you'd be hard pressed to find any King James only advocate who's aware of this. They think that there was taxation, tribute involved in the Luke 2 account. So the King James Bible is being virtually universally misunderstood when it speaks of taxation. Taxing, it turns out, is a false friend. We think we know what that means when we read it, but we don't. The Bible translators from 400 plus years ago meant something entirely different when they said taxing. Why not use a word that is communicating what the Greek says to audiences today, like registration or census? It wouldn't be corrupting God's word to update the vocabulary to the way words are used nowadays. So another whole category of dead words and false friends would be having to do with the translation of monetary terms. So when there's references to money and coinage, let's say in the New Testament, they're using terms referring to money and coinage of the day, Greek terms for Roman monetary units and coins. The King James translators, in order to make it easy for readers of the day to understand, would substitute in rough equivalents of their money system. But now that's completely obsolete. And you have a combination of words from an obsolete English system that certainly Americans aren't familiar with largely. And then there's some overlap between their words and our words, and the values have changed drastically. Like here in Matthew 22, the King James makes reference to a penny. Today, pennies have virtually zero worth. But even in America, 100 years ago, a penny was more like a dollar. Pennies used to have some value, and they would even be worth more in 17th century England. The English penny has the same name as our penny, but it's not referring to the same thing. The word that's actually being translated there, denarian, is what someone would be paid, generally like a day laborer would be paid for a full day's work. So a penny doesn't really communicate here. We're talking about paying taxes and paying a penny. A penny we think of as something worthless. This is a whole day's pay in those days. In the New King James, this is transliterated as denarius. And, all translations have to come up with decisions like what terms are we going to try to convey the meaning of it or leave untranslated. And this is where sometimes footnotes can help to kind of like, okay, this is the term they're using and this is kind of what it means. But the New King James here chose to effectively just transliterate the word that appeared in Greek. They would just use the term for that Roman coin. Now, is that corrupting God's word to change what was a rough equivalent 400 years ago in England and change it back to what the word actually meant? Isn't that better? Like, isn't that more timeless? Because the first century denarius will always be a first century denarius. The monetary system of England 400 years ago is completely irrelevant today to Americans in the 21st century. Likewise, I don't think it would be a great idea to try to translate these into today's money because values change and inflation and everything. So I think it makes sense just to leave it as is by the original author and maybe include some notes to give some insight as to what these units of money, how they relate to one another, or what their value was. So here in Matthew 20, verse 2, you can see where day laborers were paid a penny or a denarius actually for a full day's pay. And today, the idea of giving someone a penny to go work all day is bizarre. But 400 years ago in England, that works. It just doesn't anymore. So penny ends up becoming a false friend. So here's some side by sides of various King James versus New King James. They both say mite. That's a lepton. That's just a very small unit of money. Then you have farthing in Matthew 5, which even England doesn't use farthings anymore. So that's a foreign concept to an American today. But the context here, like paid every last penny, right? We could say every last dime. It's being more used as a figure of speech. So the New King James went ahead and used penny there. The monetary unit itself doesn't really matter. It just means like every little bit. But then in Luke 12, you have a different unit of money also being called a farthing. And over in the New King James, they're called copper coins. And then the footnote gives some detail about what the Greek word is and about what its worth was. It was about a 16th of a denarius. So we know a denarius is a day's wage. So this is about a 16th of a day's wage. You have some reference point given there. And then in Mark 12, again, you have mites and farthings. And in the New King James, you have mites and quadrans, which quadrans, that's a Roman coin. So this is a challenge in any translation. Like, do you leave the terminology in first century coinage, or do you try to give an estimation? The New King James does a little bit of both. Sometimes it uses a comparable term, and sometimes it gives detail in the notes. But why would you be insistent that we should use words like farthing, which are completely irrelevant today? Those words don't help to get the point across to 21st century Americans. Now, in 1611, in 17th century England, these words, sure, they made this more readable to that audience, but these terms aren't timeless. They're not of any use to people today, hundreds of years later with a completely different monetary system. So I had intended to get to these three as well, but this video is getting kind of long and I don't want it to be too long, and I don't want this stuff to get buried at the end of a long video. So I think what I'm going to do is separate these last three into their own videos and post them separately. But what I will tell you is that of these three, one of them is a mistranslation, probably influenced by theological bias. One of them is a weak translation. It's not really a mistranslation, but it could be more precise. And the other one is a false friend. So if you look at these three, maybe you could try to guess which one is which and see if you're right as those videos come out in the future.